know that you're not a supporter. A little ironic, people.
I like to blend in with whatever crowd I'm amongst.
Yes. You had the keffiyeh on earlier in the day. What do you make of this? I mean, kind of a bust, right? This idea of the 1968,
Actually,
2024. Yeah, why don't we play that clip? We have a clip that the good, clever people at the Free Press put together. Which let's look at it now.
Is she brat?
She's so brat. Oh my god.
So brat. What do you guys think about JD Vance?
He has pervert phrenology, and you could always tell by the intonation of someone's voice.
How did you learn about that?
I learned from my own experience.
Walk us through this comparison between 1968 and 2024.
Good job to the Free Press team that actually captures the contrast, because I always thought that these prophecies of some, avalanche of chaos were really overblown, in part opportunistically. Trump has been hyping it because, of course, he would want there to be as much chaos as possible. But also, the left-wing protest contingent loves to exaggerate its influence. I mean, as far as I can tell, they've been safely marginalized by the bigwigs of the Democratic Party. And you have these ridiculous scenarios. It reminds me of 2016. Remember at the Republican convention in Cleveland, there was like one guy who burned a flag or something, and he was surrounded by 85 photographers who just had to justify their existence.
By the way, I have pointed this out a number of times. In 2016, one of my favorite photos is someone during the inauguration 2017 kicked over a trash can and set it on fire. And there's a photo of 300 photojournalists in front of this one burning trash can saying, please, can you give us something to shoot?
Because you have journalists who are flying into Chicago from Finland and South Korea who can't just hang around doing nothing. They have to go report on something. So if they see one little rustling of protest activity, they're going to pounce on it.
But what about it within the hall? I mean, we had Nina Turner last night, and Nina's very vocal about her support of the Palestinian cause. She's she calls herself a social democrat. She's a Democrat. And she said there's a certain number of people that are pretty disaffected within the hall. Did you get a sense from that, or is that small of a contingent of people?
They actually then moved outside in protest when they realized they were not going to be given a slot. And I'm curious what you make of this. It seems to me like there's something really tragic here, because the protests outside fizzled because they felt like they were making because the organizers
inside game was paying dividends.
And so the organizers inside, whose job is to influence from inside, were like, we're doing really well, we're making progress here. And so that took all the wind out of the sails of the aggressive activists outside and left what Olivia reported for the Free Press was basically just like the activist influencers. But then the DNC stabbed the uncommitteds in the back and refused to give them this 2-minute, totally vetted, totally vanilla I mean, I've never seen such a vanilla Palestinian speech in my life.
It wasn't like vote for Jill Stein, vote for Cornel West. It was vote for Kamala.
Carnage is bad. Like, it was so milquetoast.
So they were outfoxed. The protesters were basically outfoxed by the Democratic apparatus.
And the worst part is because they are organizers, and I was speaking to a few of them. I mean, one of them is clearly, he didn't want anything to do with me, maybe because of my star, maybe not, but I was speaking to one who was incredibly sympathetic. She brought tears to my eyes. They were all very supportive of the hostage parents speaking. And basically, these are organizers and not activists, and so they were so upset. They thought, we're going to go outside, and they're going to see how sad we are, and they're going to change their minds. And they lost the only power they still had, which was to make a mess inside. The whole thing seemed to me to have almost this tragedy to it. What did you make of it?
Well, something really emblematic that I covered was the DNC deigned to allow a pro-Palestinian panel at one of these secondary convention sites at McCormick Place, where they just can shunt you into one of these conference
20
rooms
minutes
or something.
away. It's
you hardly get there.
I
mean, I've talked to people. We just talked about the logistics of this. I find that fascinating, actually, where people were waiting for 4 hours to transit like 1.5 miles. And people just gave up. I heard from real VIPs who I won't necessarily name just because they didn't want to be reported on, but who couldn't even get in the convention center. And the people spent a lot of money and planned months in advance to come to this. And I think there was some determination made that it didn't have to competently organize the basic functions of a convention, which is fascinating unto itself, because the RNC was super seamless. I don't think I ever waited more than 3 minutes to get into the convention center in Milwaukee. Sorry, on topic. Thank you, Batya. So I went to one of those off-site panels, and apparently somebody at the DNC, maybe connected with Tim Walz, which would make sense because he's the governor of Minnesota, decided that Keith Ellison, the current Attorney General of Minnesota, would be like the point person for placating or mollifying these dissentious pro-Palestine factions and kind of throw them a bone, you know? So they were able to hold this panel on Palestinian rights and whatever, and you know, it was interesting in that they brought a doctor who had worked at Al-Shifa Hospital and so forth, who harrowingly recounted her experiences and whatnot, but the kicker for me anyway was I spoke to Keith Ellison's son, who is a Minneapolis city councilman and also an uncommitted delegate. So he was elected as uncommitted, despite being a Democrat himself. There were other Democrats who I spoke to who were elected as Biden delegates initially, from Washington State and elsewhere, who decided they would semi-officially or informally caucus with or associate with the uncommitted delegates despite being officially elected as Biden delegates. But of course he's out of the race. So in that sense, they're unbound to him, right? But Jeremiah Healy, who's Keith Ellison's son, said, oh yeah, you know, we couldn't just sit by and do nothing. He, as an elected official, calculated that he had to try to play the inside game, right, and attempt to exert influence on the mainstream of the Democratic Party, as exemplified by the DNC power structure such as it is. And he was like, look at these inroads we're making. We got a panel on Monday, I think it was, or Tuesday. No, on Monday at 3 p.m. at some off-site convention location, a half hour away that a handful of people went to. And so my point overall is that the tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that obviously these people have just voluntarily relinquished their leverage, such as it ever existed. Obviously, uncommitted was not a huge electoral force, but it was enough that they got 40 or so delegates, which, if you wanted to, you could have made a bit of a ruckus with. But they all just kind of, bowed down to the powers that be in the party by just accepting these symbolic gestures rather than any substantive policy change, which has not been forthcoming.
Hans, I mean, sometimes I wonder, what part of this is a media creation? How much of this is actually party dissension? We talk about it quite a bit. I mean, there's constant debates. There's oftentimes more cameras outside than there are protesters. And you see the uncommitted delegates. Yeah. This is a real thing. But are Democrats actually thinking about this? Like, this is a serious thing at this convention, and even after the fact, that we have to contend with, we have to make peace with these people. This is, obviously Michigan is important to them. Yeah. How are they thinking about this, if they are at all?
I do think it's a serious issue, but I think it's been overwhelmed by the sort of religious fervor of defeating Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So so to answer the question, I don't know. It'd be hard to sort of measure just how. I think the divisions are real. You might see it in primaries in 2026 or something, but because the mission is to defeat Trump, a lot of things are being swept under the rug. And that's probably, I do think they have successfully co-opted the protesters, right?
But okay, before we let you go, I just ask you one thing very quickly. I've been saying since the beginning of the election cycle that the Democrats are going to lose Michigan, but it's not over this. It's over EV mandates and auto workers.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's accurate?
I have no idea. I think it's too. I just wouldn't want to say in August. We have to see how money's not going to decide this election. It's going to be the debates, it's going to be events that we're not thinking about, and it's going to be how the two candidates perform, namely Kamala Harris. We kind of know how Donald Trump's going to perform.
Right.
He's going to go off script.
Right.
We just don't know how Kamala Harris is going to how she's going to handle herself in a debate, how she's going to handle herself in an interview. We just don't know.
Right.
And so there's mountains of cash, like $500 million or whatever. But at this point, if cash mattered, Jeb Bush would be the Republican nominee, right? So,
or Nikki Haley.
Or Nikki Haley, cash, the events will determine this, and the candidates, sort of political athletic skills. And I just, you raised very valid points about Michigan, and the EV things those are real concerns, but I just wouldn't want to hazard a guess.
Another cynical point that I'm increasingly convinced by, I'm actually curious for your guys' thought on this, is that if Joe Biden were still the nominee, and you still had an old white guy who was the Democratic nominee, I think you might have seen more fertile ground for protesting, to take place.
Totally.
Especially on the issue of Israel-Palestine. But because Kamala is this vaunted WOC, I think that does, in a sense, undermine or neuter some of the protest energy because they're like, she's bringing about this new tone, or even like the New York Times has run articles where the progressive protesters, such as they exist on the Palestine issue, are increasingly kind of losing momentum because they're cautiously optimistic about this alleged new tone that Kamala Harris is bringing. Of course, that doesn't discernibly correlate to any substantive policy shift whatsoever, but they're kind of beguiled by this
The
new
vibes.
presentation
Yeah,
that she's bringing forth. So I think, given the underwhelming protest activity and the ease with which the uncommitted delegates were co-opted, I do think that the switcheroo that the Democrats were able to pull also, in a sense, helped to temper some of this dissension around the Palestine issue.